Okay, well, our speaker tonight is Peter Connolly. He's been a senior lecturer in religious studies at the University of Chichester, where he taught ethics, Indian religions, and psychology of religion. He's also taught both psychology and religious studies modules for the Open University. He's a certified trainer in neuro-linguistic programming, which he teaches, and he's given numerous talks on issues in philosophy, psychology, and religion to a variety of audiences, including sixth form students, postgraduates, and fellow academics. His most recent book, Understanding Religious Experience, unfortunately is not on sale tonight because it's due to be published next February, so do look out for it. This is Peter's second talk for Dorset Humanists, so it's very good to have you back, Peter. So will you please give Peter a very warm welcome.
As we were setting things up this evening, can I just check that the microphone is making sure that everyone at the back can hear what I'm saying? Yes, people are putting their thumbs up, that's great. And it came to me that I'm really glad that I have a pair of ears, because I have two hearing aids in. I have a hook on each ear that's holding this microphone thing. And once I start, I'll be briefly looking at my notes and wearing some spectacles. So they'll be doing 3 tasks for me this evening. Just a little aside, I thought, to get things rolling. The talk I'll be giving this evening will be in 2 not quite equal parts. First of all, I'll talk about what we might call philosophical attempts to persuade, which is essentially putting together what philosophers call sound arguments, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then I'll move on to what I call rhetorical persuasion or rhetorical tricks. And these are many and varied. You'll be familiar with quite a few of them. You'll also know lots of others that people use. All the ones I mention are very powerful, and some of the examples I have are also rather humorous, so I think they should lighten the issue under consideration. If you want to just make a note, the 4 approaches to rhetorical persuasion that I'll be covering are reciprocity, emotive labeling, what I call structured delivery, and finally something from hypnosis called the yes set, but it's also used in many places outside of hypnosis. David's kindly transformed some of my notes into slides, so I'm hoping they will just help a little bit in giving a visual version of the things I'm saying about philosophical arguments. Yeah. Putting together a sound argument is a difficult task. We can fall into error in myriad ways, and researchers do. But what we're looking for in a robust argument is essentially true statements or premises which are arranged in such a way that the conclusion automatically arises out of the premises, or as philosophers say, the conclusion is entailed by the premises or demanded by the premises. One common error that people make when putting rigorous arguments together is that they construct them in an invalid way. In other words, the relationship that connects the premises together and connects the premises to the conclusion isn't as strong as people think it is. So what we're looking for is what philosophers call a valid relationship between the premises and the conclusion. But validity is only part or half of constructing a robust argument. The other side is that the premises need to be true. You only have a sound argument if the premises are true and the relationships within the argument are valid. So I'll give you a few examples because there are 4 possible relationships between validity and truth. The first one is here, where we have an example of an argument that is both valid and the conclusion is true. Now these arguments are very, very simple, but the same underlying structure applies nevertheless even in very complicated arguments. And in complicated arguments often you will find a multiplicity of this kind of statement. So this is pretty straightforward, and we can see from the diagram, okay, dogs are mammals, mammals are animals, therefore dogs are animals. Quite clear visually that the class of dogs is located within the class of mammals. Now you might be thinking, all this working out which category goes within which or what the relationship is, it's pretty simple stuff. But I would invite you to consider the many ways in which whether you are inside or outside a category can have quite profound effects on your experience of being alive. One of the cards I have in my wallet is a driving license. That allows me to drive a motor vehicle, which I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. I recently swapped an old paper one for a plastic one with the photograph on, and that allows me to go into different places and notify them of a change of address because I've just moved to Bournemouth, and register at the doctors and things like this. And another card I have is a pensioner's bus pass. If I climb on a Bournemouth bus and flash the little card on the reader, then I can travel on the bus for free. And those are just kind of trivial examples, nevertheless they affect my everyday life. If someone is categorized as an asylum seeker, they get very different treatment from someone who's classified as an economic migrant. Someone who has proof of identity as a student can get student concessions, they can use university libraries and so on and so forth. And there are many, many, many cases in life generally where which category you happen to be in has a major influence on the kind of experience that you have. So this kind of categorization does have far-reaching effects. This is an example where the premises are true, or you can check it in your own experience. All dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals. Would anyone dissent with those statements? Anyone think they're false? No, but the conclusion is false because the relationship between the two true premises does not support the conclusion. The conclusion has gone beyond what the evidence will support. Now you can see quite clearly here that dogs and cats are mammals, but that all the dogs and the cats are in fact separate categories. Here we have a valid argument, but the conclusion is false. If you think back to the first example I gave you, this is exactly the same structure. All cows are green, so all humans are mortal. I am a cow, I am a human, therefore I am green. So the validity is there, the structure, the relationship is valid, but the premises, or in both cases, the premises are false. But you only need one premise, and you still end up with an unsound argument. But if you're not sure about the the status of the premises, you might be taken in by this. You might recognise this is a valid argument structure. But because you're not sure of one of the premises, you might be prepared to swallow it, thinking, well, it probably is. It's an important person who's saying this. It looks like a valid argument, therefore I'll tend to go along with it. No. You also need to check out the truth or the robustness of the premises as well as the structure of the argument. And here we have an invalid argument, but which nevertheless has a true conclusion. Sees across the Rubicon. True. And when I was writing this, I am now typing these comments was also true. And 2 plus 2 does in fact equal 4. So there we have 3 true premises. But nevertheless, this is an unsound argument. And the reason is that the relationship between the premises does not support the conclusion. In fact, there's no relationship at all between any of them. But nevertheless, the conclusion is true. Validity is important because it gives us that other dimension for evaluating the quality of arguments that people put forward. Now, a lot of the time, we do not, or we can't be sure that the premises that we're using to construct the argument are in fact true. So how do we proceed? Well, one way is to use a conditional argument. In other words, we say, if this is the case, and it's quite likely that it is, but I'm not absolutely certain, then these kind of things follow. And this is a simple version. I think it's on the next one. No, I missed that out, but it could be something like, if you live in my house, then you are a student. You live in my house, therefore you are a student. And that's what's illustrated here. If A, then B, A, therefore B. And it also works with negatives. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And those are both valid forms of conditional arguments. However, these two look very similar, but you end up with an unsound argument. If A then B, B therefore A. Philosophers call this affirming the consequent. This is the consequent, the B, because it comes second. And I'm guessing that most of you can see why, or where the problem or fault lies with this structure. Why does affirming the truth of B not guarantee that A, which if that applies, guarantees B? Why does B not guarantee A? Anyone like to have a shot? Yes, somebody in the back there.
There may be many other things that guarantee B.
Exactly. So you can't be sure that A has delivered B. Something else, a C or a D or whatever it might be, might have delivered B. You know that A will deliver B, but you might get B by some other means. So that's an invalid argument. And this is the same in a negative version. So I've just summarised it here. When you come to conditional arguments, I mean, they're more complex than this. This is just kind of boiling it down to a few simple principles. If you affirm the antecedent, in other words, if you affirm the A, or if you deny the consequent, if you deny the B, you've got a valid structure. But if you affirm the consequent, or if you deny the antecedent, then you've got an invalid argument. I'm just going through this a little bit, partly to show the challenges that face people who try to construct robust philosophical arguments. It's a tough job, and philosophers get together and tear each other's arguments apart. If you want something fairly light-hearted that does something similar, there's a channel on YouTube that's run by a young philosopher whose name slips my mind at the moment, but it's called Rationality Rules. And if you go on YouTube, his little extracts, they only last about 15 minutes, they're often called such and such a thing, you know, the argument for the existence of God debunked. And one of the things that he does is take arguments that people have put forward and identify where they've gone wrong. And he'll often say, this commits the fallacy of X, Y, or Z, and he will explain what that fallacy is. So he is doing, with claims that are out there in the internet universe, a version of what I'm kind of offering here. And so he identifies the logical structure of the argument and shows where it's flawed. So that's quite entertaining. And then what have we got? Oops. That's jumping on to rhetoric. Yeah. So that's all I want to say about philosophical argumentation. There are, of course, a lot more to it than I've commented on, but I hope I've given you some idea, for those of you who aren't familiar with this area, of how hard it is to put a good philosophical argument together. You have to do the scientific research to arrive at the truth of premises, and you also have to be quite rigorous and careful in constructing the argument itself, putting things in the right relationship so that you have a conclusion that will stand scrutiny. There's a kind of intermediate zone between robust philosophical arguments and a lot of the rhetorical tricks that I'm going to come on to here. And this intermediate zone, I think, tends to fall within the sphere of what philosophers call fallacies. And I brought along a book just to read a couple of examples from it. It's a book that I have an emotional attachment to. It was bought by my father for me in the early 1970s when I was studying A-level logic, and he died a couple of years ago, so that gives it a bit of emotional charge for me. It's a book by an American logician called Irving Copy, C-O-P-I, and it's been in many editions. And if you want to dip into logic, he's a very humorous writer, and one of the few people I know who makes logic fun, in as far as logic can be fun, because it's a real brain ache as well. But his examples are great, and I'm going to share one or two of them with you. He defines a fallacy as a type of argument that may seem to be correct, but which proves upon examination not to be so. It is profitable to study such arguments for familiarity and understanding will help keep us from being misled by them. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. Now, logicians have identified over 20 what they call informal fallacies, which aren't just simply abstract structures like these, but more conversational errors that people fall into. And I've picked out a couple here. Most of them have Latin names. One is the argumentum ad misericordiam, which is the appeal to pity. And It's often used in courts of law when the defense doesn't have a really good argument, so they turn to the jury and hope they'll take pity on the person. And Copey gives one example of what he thinks is a ludicrous use, where a youth who was tried for a particularly brutal crime, the murder of his mother and father with an axe, when confronted with overwhelming proof of his guilt, he pleaded for leniency on the grounds that he was an orphan. Orphan, yes, sorry. So you see what I mean about picking good examples. The book's full of them. Yeah, I should give one more, I think. This is an important one, equivocation. He says most words have more than one literal meaning, as the word pen may denote either an instrument for writing or an enclosure for animals. When we keep these meanings apart, no difficulty arises, but when we confuse the different meanings a single word or phrase may have, using it in different senses in the same context, we are using it equivocally. That's quite common, and it's sometimes difficult to spot the trick that's being played on you when the same word is used in two different ways. And here's Copey's example. The end of a thing is its perfection. Death is the end of life, hence death is the perfection of life. Sounds plausible, but perfection is being used in two quite different ways. It's difficult to spot because we're carried away by thinking, well, A and perfection is an A in one sentence and an A in another sentence, so it's probably not the same thing. But in fact, as Copey points out, it's not. So, logical fallacies are the first step in tricking us into accepting a conclusion because it seems plausible. Now I want to move into some more straightforward, deceptive strategies, which are also quite humorous, I think. The first is reciprocity. A major problem for evolutionary biologists in the 60s and early 70s was altruism. Sacrificing your own well-being to help your kin made sense because your kinfolk share your genes, but strangers don't. So why would you help a stranger at a cost to yourself? That was a bit of a puzzle. And then quite a colourful biologist who worked at Harvard but lived a lot of the time in Jamaica, called Robert Trivers, came up with a theory that he called reciprocal altruism. It's the old, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But he elaborated it in different ways. I'll just give you one simple kind of slant on it. It's very beneficial to me and my gene pool if you need some assistance that doesn't cost me very much. So let's say you're really thirsty and you need a drink of water. So I can share my water with you, you can partake or just pass it back. It's no great cost to me. Nevertheless, you're grateful for the help I gave you when you were really thirsty. So you're in debt. You have this reciprocal obligation. And when I'm in need, if I ask you for help, and it's not going to cost you too much, but it benefits me a lot, then we both gain, because my little sacrifice gave you a big help, And your little sacrifice gave me a big help. So we both benefit and our genes benefit. So that was how he went about explaining how evolutionary forces can actually accommodate altruistic behavior. And by extension, you can then increase benefits to your genes by creating a good reputation. The better your reputation, the more people will trust you. If people trust you, then they're more likely to cooperate with you. And if they cooperate with you, then you can achieve things with them that you couldn't achieve on your own. So there are all kinds of benefits that derive from adopting a reciprocal relationship with other people. In fact, this is so strong that it is exploited in many ways, and the sense of obligation can go very deep. I'll quote one example here. In a book called Influence, Science and Practice, psychologist Robert Cialdini was struck by words in passing. In 1985, when Ethiopia was experiencing a severe famine, the Ethiopian government sent $5,000 of relief aid to Mexico City to help the victims of an earthquake that had occurred that year. So there's a famine in Ethiopia, and they sent $5,000 to Mexico. Many of us will just think, interesting, but he thought there's something funny there. Why would Ethiopia, in dire straits, send $5,000 to Mexico? So he started to do some digging. And what he discovered was that in 1935, Mexico had sent aid to Ethiopia when they were invaded by the Italians. For all that time, the Ethiopian government had been living with that reciprocal debt. And when they got the opportunity, they cleared it by sending $5,000. Even though their country was in dire straits, it was important to their government to relieve themselves, so to speak. Obviously, they did it to help the Mexicans, but Cialdini points out that that debt had been lying there and was just waiting for the opportunity to be relieved. Manipulators exploit this in a variety of ways. I'll pick out three here. One is called consistency, the second commitment, and the third concession. Consistency plays a role in reciprocity, partly because a consistent person is reliable, is predictable, whereas an inconsistent person is very unpredictable and therefore unreliable. So people are hesitant to cooperate with people who are inconsistent. And also being consistent makes our own lives easier. In fact, research carried out some years ago on brain activity during learning and subsequent recall found some quite interesting results in that when people were learning something for the first time, the whole brain was active. And then when they went back to it next time, a little bit less was active. And when they went back next time, or did whatever it was that they'd learned, if it was a skill, the brain was a little bit less active. Till eventually, when they became very proficient at doing what it was that the people had learned, or talking about it, or writing about it, only a little teeny weeny bit of their brain lit up. And of course that then enables effortless performance of high standards. That's why footballers train every day. And what you see on the pitch in a match is something that they've been learning for weeks and weeks until it becomes automatic. And we have a natural tendency to automate our behaviour because it relieves us of the cognitive load of doing things step by step using the conscious mind. The conscious mind uses a lot of brain energy and is very slow and ponderous. So when you're learning the piano, it's plonk, 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 plonk. The more you practice, the better you get, until eventually conscious involvement in playing a piano will ruin playing a tune rather than enhance it. Better to just let the whole thing go on automatic, and then you get the fluidity. Consistency lays the basis for commitment. And once we commit to something, we experience a subtle change in our self-image, particularly if we're a consistent kind of person. So if we take something new on board or cultivate a new behaviour, it becomes part of who we are, part of our identity. And this can be exploited. I'll give you an example here. Two psychologists, Jonathan Freeman and Scott Fraser, went door to door to houses in California suburb, asking people to display a 3-inch sign saying, "Be a safe driver." And some people agreed to do it, and some people didn't. 2 weeks later, the same team returned to the area and asked people to display an almost billboard sign saying, "Drive carefully," that they stuck in their front gardens. Only 17% of the people in that suburb complied with the request, but 76% who agreed to put the small poster in their window agreed to the billboard size one on their lawn. So this is a bit of the old foot in the door kind of technique. Once you've made that little shift, then your self-image changes and you become more receptive or more vulnerable to further concessions. 76% is a big shift. You've got to do it correctly though. This is a cartoon illustrating a concession going wrong. First ask him for $1, and after he says no, ask him for the 25 cents. "Mr. Bumstead, will you give us 25 cents? "No, sorry guys." "Well, will you give us $1? And then his mate said, no, you said that wrong. You got it the wrong way around. But if you ask for the $1 and then say, okay, how about 25 cents? Because you drop what you're asking for, the person who's receiving the request is more likely to cough up the smaller amount. And then, of course, they've begun that process of, just like putting the small sign in the window, giving you something, and then next time you go along, you've already got that. I'll be coming back to this in the final bit when I talk about the yes set. There's also a similar kind of recoil effect in a student letter that Robert Cialdini inserted into his book. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. Dear Mum and Dad, since I left for college, I have been remiss in writing, and I am sorry for my thoughtlessness in not having written before. I will bring you up to date now, but before you read on, please sit down. You are not to read any further unless you are sitting down, okay? Well then, I am getting along pretty well now. The skull fracture and concussion I got when I jumped out of the window of my dormitory when it caught fire shortly after my arrival here is pretty well healed now. I only spent 2 weeks in the hospital and now I can see almost normally and only get those sick headaches once a day. Fortunately, the fire in the dormitory and my jump was witnessed by an attendant at the petrol station near the dorm, and he was the one who called the fire brigade and the ambulance. He also visited me in the hospital, and since I had nowhere to live because of the burnt-out dormitory, he was kind enough to invite me to share his apartment with him. It's really a basement room, but it's kind of cute. He's a very fine boy, and we have fallen deeply in love and are planning to get married. We haven't set the exact date yet, but it will be before my pregnancy begins to show. Yes, Mother and Dad, yes, I am pregnant. I know how much you are looking forward to being grandparents, and I know you will welcome the baby and give it the same love and devotion and tender care you gave me as a child. The reason for the delay in our marriage is that my boyfriend has a minor infection which prevents us from passing our premarital blood tests, and I carelessly caught it from him. I know, however, that you will welcome him into our family with open arms. He is kind, and although not well educated, he is ambitious. Although he is a different race and religion than ours, I know your often expressed tolerance will not permit you to be bothered by that. Now that I have brought you up to date, I want to tell you that there was no dormitory fire. I did not have concussion or a skull fracture. I was not in the hospital. I am not pregnant. I am not engaged. I am not infected, and there is no boyfriend. However, I am getting a D in history and an F in chemistry. And I want you to see those marks in their proper perspective.
Brilliant.
So, whoops. He got it wrong, I think she got it right. Another subtle way to get a concession is for somebody to give you something before you even ask for it. Classic example, a used car lot. So you're looking around and you're thinking, oh, this looks interesting, and the salesman comes up to you and said, oh yes, that's quite a nice car. Just wait a moment, I'll see if I can get the manager to give you a reduction. And before you can say anything else, he pops into the office, comes out 5 minutes later, said, I've had a good long talk with him and he's agreed. If you buy this vehicle today, we'll give you 10% off. Now, why has he done that? He's given you a non-existent free gift. He's put himself out. He's done something to inconvenience himself and done you a favour and given you this 10% reduction. What does that mean? It means that you are now indebted to him, even though you've received nothing. And I've given a version of this talk to other groups and had more time, and often shown a clip from a film called House of Games. The actor Joe Mantegna is in it. You can look it up on the internet, only cost a couple of quid. The library might even have it. It's well worth watching. It's about a group of confidence tricksters, and it's very well constructed, and you can see a lot of these strategies being used in the course of the film. It's called House of Games. Free samples work in the same kind of way, and I've collected a few over the years. These tend to come before Christmas. Usually charitable organisations send them. But when you inspect them, you find that they're not much of a gift, really. Like this one, I haven't used this pen, but it's only a third full of ink. The barrel is made of cardboard. There's no top on, so if it does leak, there's nothing to stop it. It's a very flimsy thing and not really much of a gift. Look at these things. And these are all the same kind of stuff. Virtually nothing in the pen, no proper top or anything. So what are these organizations doing by sending me these kinds of things? They're seeking to trigger that reciprocal response. That's their only purpose. This is no real benefit to you. It's almost an insult. In fact, when I get these things, I tend to treat them as insults because their only purpose is to manipulate my thinking and manipulate my emotions to get me into that space where I feel obligated, where I feel I have a debt to pay. But it's not for anything worthwhile, not like the help that the Mexicans sent the Ethiopians. This is no gift at all. And when you're confronted on the street, Hare Krishnas are the classic example. Would you like one of our free Hare Krishna books? Well, yeah, that looks interesting. And we're seeking donations. In other words, they want some money. So now I tend to say to them, is this really a gift? And if they say, well, only if you donate, I tend to say, well, then you're selling it and I don't really want to buy it. Or they say yes, so then I say, okay, thank you very much. I like receiving gifts and go on my way. I might give them some money, but I'm then in control myself and not being manipulated by the free gift strategy. Classic example of a gift with a sting is one that most of us will be acquainted with. It's the wooden horse of Troy. The Greeks left the Trojan shore and left this large wooden horse behind as a gift to the Trojan people. So they took it inside their walls, and then the Greeks came out at night and destroyed the city. That's a kind of major example, but these little ones, they're all using the same kind of technique. They're all manipulating this evolved tendency for reciprocal obligation. And it's very, very powerful indeed, as the Ethiopian case shows. Okay. Oh, just another example, the Tupperware party. And this is exploiting friendships. You've been invited to a Tupperware party, and when you're invited to a social occasion, that in itself sets up an obligation to be included in the group of invitees. So, almost inevitably, when people go to a Tupperware party or similar kind of event, they're going to buy something. The very situation itself puts you in that position where you are obliged to your host or hostess to pay up in some way or another. Okay, moving on. Oh, one final example here, and this is the referral. So a salesman knocks on the door and says, would you like to buy this lovely set of encyclopedias? And the person says, well, no, not at the moment, thank you. And then the salesman says, well, if you were going to buy a set of encyclopedias, would this be the one you want? Oh, yes, you say, keeping him happy. But you're not in a position to buy this fine set of encyclopedias at the moment. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. Well, that's okay. But perhaps you could give me the name of a few friends and acquaintances on whom I could call? So he's elicited some information from you for nothing at all, simply by getting you to admit something that you probably only half believe anyway, that you would be buying these encyclopedias, and these are probably the best encyclopedias around. So why would you not recommend them to your friends and neighbours? Okay. I slipped in a little section called Emotive Labeling here because it does seem to be something that's on the rise in our culture at the moment. It's connected with the fallacy I mentioned earlier called equivocation, where you use the same word in different ways, or you use a word in an inappropriate way. Now, if we are generous, we could say that using emotionally charged words as describing words, as descriptors, could be simply in order to boil the issue down to its essence. If we are more skeptical, we might think that using these emotive words is a way of getting you to make a judgment in the absence of robust supporting evidence. I'll give you a couple of examples in our current cultural exchanges. Quite a lot of groups in Britain, the United States and Canada have taken to using words like fascist, Nazi, racist, Stalinist, and I'll come to a couple of others in a moment, which have a history of being negative judgments for good reasons, because people who operated from within those categories did horrible things because of the value systems that were encapsulated in those categories. So if you call somebody a fascist, that means that they have stepped into the role that people who did very bad things in the past have adopted. And same with Nazis or racists. But the other side of it is it could just be a quick way of trying to get someone to make a negative judgment about somebody in the absence of relevant information. Yes, 15 minutes. Okay, thanks, David. A couple of other examples are Islamophobia and its antonym Islamophilia. One of the things about these terms is they have psychiatric as well as everyday uses. So there's something borrowed from psychiatry here. If you look at ancient Greek, and probably modern Greek as well, the term phobia simply means a fear. But in the psychiatric literature, if someone is diagnosed with a phobia, then the understanding is that that fear, whatever they're fearful of, is irrational. So to say that someone is Islamophobic is to say that their fear of Islam is irrational. Same with the antonym, Islamophilia. Now, the most prominent use of the suffix philia in our culture is paedophilia. There are groups, vigilante groups, going around identifying paedophiles so that neighbourhoods can take precautions and protect their children, and they're reporting them to the police and so on and so forth. And the idea of paedophilia is that paedophiles have a warped understanding of children's sexuality. But when you put the two together, you end up in a peculiar kind of situation, because the Islamophiles, or those who are labelled Islamophiles, are what the labellers are seeking to convey is that these people who love Islam have a warped understanding of Islam. And similarly, if you label somebody as an Islamophobe, then they too have a warped understanding of Islam. So whether you're an Islamophile or an Islamophobe, you have a warped understanding. Now, either group might have a warped understanding, but logically, they can't both have an accurate understanding, because what one group fears, the other group loves the same thing. So the answer is probably somewhere in the middle ground, but these emotive labels shortcut accurate argumentation based on relevant evidence and seek to get people to respond in a way that simply matches the emotional judgment of the person using the label. So that's just a little aside on that one. Next, very quickly, structured delivery. I've taken most of this from a book in the 1980s by the sociologist Max Atkinson. Some of you may have come across it. It's called Our Master's Voices. He was interested particularly in the structure of the speeches, particularly at political rallies, that elicited standing ovations. What was it about these speeches that got people to jump up and clap their hands and say, "Hear, hear, great, great," and so on and so forth? And what he discovered was a very strong tendency to use one or both of two strategies. One he called the three-part list, and the other he called contrastive pairs. The contrastive pairs is a little more subtle, a little more difficult to use, but nevertheless very effective when you can pull it off. I've got a few examples here. First of all, some very simple three-part lists, and this one goes back to the period that Atkinson was studying. Maggie, 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 out, out, out. Or, to take a religious example, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We shall fight, fight, fight. Education, 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 for those who remember Tony Blair. Spend and spend, borrow and borrow, tax and tax, the opposition response. Or you can make it progressive. We have purpose, we have strategy, and we have resolve. We have vigour, imagination, and determination. They are ideologically, politically, and morally bankrupt. We will restore trust in the law, trust in education, and trust in the health service. And what usually happens when these three-part lists are delivered is that the first two items are spoken with a rising intonation. And we use that for questions. Do you mean that? Whereas the third one is spoken with a falling intonation, which is a tonality that we tend to use for commands. Close that window. So you get a sense at the end of the third of completion. So there's something quite psychologically and emotionally satisfying about it. In fact, I encourage all my Open University students, when they're writing their essays and they are thinking about how many examples should I pop in here, there's a dozen to choose from, I say the magic number 3. 3 examples will give the reader of the essay a sense that you've selected enough, that sense of this is sufficient, that sense of completion. And in the 1500 essay, which my current students are writing at the moment, I say to them, well, you can split the first 500-600 words between the introduction and the conclusion. That leaves you 400 or 500 words per example. It's a nice symmetrical arrangement, and if you follow that well, you'll get a good mark. Not maybe a standing ovation, but nevertheless the same principle is at work. Here's a few more examples, some of them quite familiar. Winston Churchill, he was a master of it. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Caesar, I came, I saw, conquer me. Mark Antony, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And then the contrastive pairs, man is born free, and everywhere he is found in chains. George Orwell, all are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And Jomo Kenyatta, when the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us to pray with our eyes closed. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land.
Very good.
Now, the fact that you're laughing at these shows that you appreciate the humour and the wit of the construction of them, but also appreciating some of the power behind them. They have a sense that the composer has captured something in its essence here, just with a few lines, and it's the structure that does it. My last little bit will have to be brief because I'm almost out of time. This is called the yes set. So I'd invite you to sit comfortably. Because as you're sitting there listening to me speak, and perhaps reflecting on what you've heard, you might not be fully aware of the points at which the chair is supporting your body. You might not even be fully aware of the sensation of your feet inside your shoes, or even the rising and falling of your breath. Note the three-part list there. What I do know is that if you devote just a little attention to the air coming in and out of your nose, you can become more aware of the rhythm of your breathing. And as you become aware of the rhythm of your breathing in a deeper kind of way, so you can begin to relax, perhaps making yourselves more comfortable in your chair, maybe adjusting your position. Because it's nice to relax. When we relax, we often become more creative. We can tap into levels of our being that we often ignore. And here in a group of like-minded people with humanist values, I know that all of you have a concern for the well-being of people, not just in your immediate family, but also in the wider world. And I know that you value these meetings, these opportunities to come and hear people talk and discuss amongst yourselves and develop your own understanding and direction in the world. So as you reflect on those values, now and later when you leave, do remember that places like this do cost some money to hire. And you might want to remember the benefits, not only to yourself and your reputation, but also to the group and the humanist cause as a whole, of generosity. So if you can keep that in mind as you leave, then I think we'll all depart much happier. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got some time for questions. The rules apply. I don't allow you to speak unless you have the microphone in your hand. A quick training session when you've got the microphone, just hold it steady in front of you, point it at you, and then we'll be able to hear you. So Phil's got the mic. Has anyone got any questions beginning to bubble up in their mind about, yes, gentlemen.
Could I just say that I also welcome challenges to anything that I said. You don't need to ask me a question, I'm not an expert. If you think I've made a mistake or I'm misguided on something, then I think that's just as valuable as a question might be. Thank you.
I understand. No, I don't understand. Is it working? No.
I think that's supposed to be Did you say it like that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I understand the motivation when you're trying to persuade somebody you have an end result, a salesman. We're surrounded by religious and political zealots at the moment. They don't seem to have a one-to-one benefit from their cause. I wonder what motivates people to try and change people's mind en masse.
I have the same wonderings. I have spent quite a bit of time studying this stuff, and much of religion is still a puzzle to me. And nevertheless, there are certain features of it that give people a sense of satisfaction. But let me just pick out a small slice of the sources of that satisfaction, because it's a complex topic. In 1957, I think it was, or just after that, a couple of sociologists in the United States heard about a group who were prophesying a great flood striking North America. And they had received this information from extraterrestrial aliens. And one of the members of the group was receiving these messages. So the sociologists joined the group as believers. And when the time came for the great flood to happen, they all went up this mountain awaiting the arrival of the aliens who had said that they would come and collect them. Now, people took this stuff really seriously. They sold their houses, they quit their jobs, they sometimes left members of their extended family to join this group because they thought the overall benefits of so doing were great enough to warrant the sacrifice. So there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis here. When the aliens didn't, and one thing about them was that when the press tried to interview members of the group about their beliefs, they wouldn't talk to the press. However, when the aliens didn't come, the group split. Half of them said, this was a waste of time, we've been fooled, we've been misled, we're going to go back and try and put our lives together. But the remainder said, this was probably a test, this was probably a warning, so let's call a press conference and tell the world we've survived one morning, we won't survive the next. And so they became, as you say, zealots, trying to promote their particular view of life. Now, one of the social psychologist called Leon Festinger, he used this as an example of what he called cognitive dissonance, that the proselytizing was motivated by the need to maintain an internal equilibrium. So half of the group maintained their equilibrium by saying, we've been conned, let's go back to how we were behaving before. But the other half wanted to preserve their beliefs, so they had to go off and proselytize and get more people involved. And I think cognitive dissonance might not be the answer, but there is something about having a belief that quite a few others are skeptical about, that leads people who derive security, comfort, meaning from it to make it credible. And one way to make it credible is to get more people to buy into it. I remember as a child reading Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, and in the second story, Mowgli, the little boy who's reared by the wolves, is captured by the monkey people, the Bandar-log. And one of their chants is, "It must be true, we all say so." And there's something about getting people in to agree with you that feels more secure. When you're in an environment where people are challenging you all the time, that promotes feelings of insecurity. So one of the motivators is for this consistency, to make your belief credible and to feel more secure. Now that's not the whole story, but I think it's part of it.
Okay, do we have any more questions for Peter?
Or points of disagreement. I used to say to my students, if you can get me to admit that anything I said is mistaken, misguided or false, I will buy you a bar of chocolate of your choice. And on quite a number of occasions I bought my students bars of chocolate because they persuaded me that I'd made a mistake. We all make mistakes. I had a nice experience in Canada a few years back. I made the same offer to this group I was talking to, and at the end of the weekend this guy came up to me and gave me a bar of chocolate. I said, "What's this for?" He said, "Well, I didn't persuade you that you got something wrong, but you persuaded me, so I thought you deserved the chocolate." which was really nice. But I think that spirit is important, particularly for groups like this of humanists, to recognise our own fallibility and being willing, perhaps after a good night's sleep rather than in the immediate moment, but being willing to change our views in the light of good evidence and robust argumentation. So if I have said anything that's ill-founded or misguided or mistaken, I would like you to share it with me. I might kind of put up resistance, but if it's a good point that you're making, I'll go home and sleep on it and probably wake up with a different outlook in the morning. So I do value those perspectives.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, Connor first and then David.
I was wondering if you have a belief in something that is based on a valid argument, and for all intents and purposes, let's say that belief is true.
Yep.
So let's say, just for the sake of argument, human-induced climate change, because a vast majority of climatologists and climate scientists
Yep.
believe that humans are having an impact on the climate. So if you have that belief that that is happening,
Yep.
and it is based on valid premises, and as far as we understand the science, the conclusion is
Yep.
true, it is happening.
Yep.
What would you say to using in trying to persuade? Firstly, would you try to persuade other people who don't agree with that they should change their views, so we all come on board and do something about it, as it were? And more, what do you think about using arguments or attempting to persuade people in a way, in a sense, in a false way, to get them to come over to the right side, but you're using tricks and false ways to do it?
I don't really have any moral qualms about doing that. As I said at the beginning, constructing robust philosophical evidence-based arguments is difficult. For people who want that, nothing else will do, really. Nevertheless, even someone who is open-minded might not quite understand the force of what you're saying. I'm reminded of many years ago, I read Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It's very, very different from the Danny Kaye movie, and it's a book I thoroughly recommend. In the middle of it, the Yankee, who has established himself at the court as the third the king, the queen, and the boss, he calls himself. He becomes friendly with the king, King Arthur, and he persuades the king that it would be a good idea to go incognito into the surrounding English countryside to find out what his subjects really thought. Because the courtiers always gave elaborated, praiseworthy kind of descriptions. So they go off in disguise, and they come to this place, and they're talking, I think it's to a miller. And the Yankee says, oh, how much do millers earn around here? And the guy says something like, oh, well, we get 5 shillings a week. How much do millers earn where you come from? And the Yankee says, well, they earn about 3 shillings a week. Oh, well, we're a lot better off than they are, says the miller. And the Yankee says, well, maybe. How much do you pay for bread? And the miller says, a shilling. And the Yankee says, oh, well, we only pay half of that. How much you pay for eggs? And he says, well, 2 shillings. And the Yankee says, well, we only pay half of that. And so they go through this whole thing, and it's quite clear that the 3 shillings of the millers in the capital buy a lot more resources than the 5 shillings that the miller can spend where he lives. And so the Yankee says, you know, knockdown argument, do you now understand why our millers are better off than you? And the miller says, well, I thought I was following you, but you did say that your millers earn 3 shillings and we earn 5, so we're better off. Sometimes it just doesn't sink in for some people, even if they might be open-minded. So then we can use the 3-part list, we can use contrastive pairs, we can use the yes set, and if we are confident about our ethics, we can manipulate them into the right view. Now, I've probably overstepped the mark here, but I think it's worth discussing, you know, that kind of issue. But that's my initial response, that let's give it a shot, yeah. I'll use the 3-part list on them.
I think it's a really... Is this one on? Oh yeah, it is now. I think that's a really interesting question, you know, because we, you know, as humanists, we are interested in rationality and truth and all of that, and in ethics. So, you know, it's a really interesting question as to whether we can use manipulative ways to persuade people not to believe in God or whatever, you know, whatever we think is the truth. But I've got a quick response as well to Connor on that one. I mean, I think some of the climatologists, Stephen Snyder was a climatologist who deliberately sort of hyped up the catastrophism with climate change, and I think that's backfired to some degree. And I think once people call it out, it was like in the, I daren't mention Brexit, but I have now, you know, the whole Project Fear thing. Once people call it out, it ceases to have the desired effect. And then, of course, everything becomes Project Fear. So I think those things can backfire. Anyway.
Oh, just a tag on that. Steven Pinker made a point when he was on a panel recently about mainstream media neglecting to report issues that people encounter through other forms of social media. And he was explaining the undesirable consequences of this. He said, because when somebody discovers something that is factually the case, and has been neglected or glossed over by mainstream media, they start to then distrust mainstream media and start to trust more these alternative sources, which some of which may be of very dubious quality indeed. So there is a benefit, I think, for whoever's promoting a particular view, let's say global warming, to offer bars of chocolate to their audiences and say, you know, there are some questions that people might ask, there are issues that people might challenge us about, and, you know, we're open to discussing all these publicly. If those questions are sidelined or suppressed, then you're going to get this kind of pinker back road effect that could have profound unintended consequences.
Dave was next.
I think probably you've covered most of this, but a lot of your arguments seem to be about deception and trickery.
Yeah.
And I find that a little bit depressing in a way, because some of the famous figures you quoted in history have used these techniques. And I wondered if you believe that we wouldn't have had the world we'd had unless people had used those techniques. And would it ever have been possible for things to change without those clever three-part speeches and everything? I mean, would Churchill have had the effect if he hadn't had a writer who said, this is how you're going to say it, this is how you're going to persuade the people? But because in a way it seems that the whole of humanity has been tricked and cajoled into a way of being.
I see what you're saying, and certainly you can use these things for, let's say, devious or wicked ends, and you can also use them for good ends. A saw can saw someone's arm off, or it can saw a piece of wood and help you build a house. It's a tool. These are tools. I mentioned at the very beginning that book, My Overing Copy, was given to me by my father, so it has emotional resonance for me. I spoke briefly at my father's funeral, and I used the three-part list. I said, my father, as far as I know, was a good man. He lived a good life, and he died a good death. And for that, I and my family are grateful. That's using the three-part list, but I don't see it as deceptive in any way or unethical in any way. In fact, I think putting it in that kind of nutshell encapsulated something quite worthy about my father's life.
Perhaps it's the power of poetry too. The poetry is very similar to that.
Yeah, and so you can use it for good or evil. You know, you can write poetry that demeans people, or you can write poetry that elevates people. So I think these are tools. How people use them is up to them, and also open for discussion. But if you spot the tool, it then becomes easier to decide whether it's being used for good or ill. If you don't spot the tool, if you think, oh, there's something about that, but I don't quite know what, then you're not in as fortunate a position to evaluate it, I would say.
We haven't seen the Jehovah's Witnesses at our door for many, many years. I think it's because they're now actually in town. But a few months ago, a very nice young woman from Greenpeace knocked on the door and started engaging my values, you know, in environmental values, and do I agree with this and do I agree with that? And of course, yes, I was saying all the things she wanted to hear. And I just knew that this was going towards, you know, and can we sign you up for the direct debit? And I felt, you know, this kind of resistance rising up in me, and I was thinking, I shouldn't have even let this start, you know. As soon as I saw a woman from Greenpeace, I should have said, don't even start, you know, because I got caught up with it. So it was very difficult when it came to the crunch.
Yeah.
So she'd obviously been trained very well in these techniques.
Yeah.
You say no.
I think I did in the end. But yeah, I was very hard-nosed, but
No, but I came up with my own kind of solution to that kind of situation, because when I reflected on my response to charitable requests, I found myself rather inconsistent. So that didn't fit with my self-image. I wanted to be a consistent kind of person, and so I thought, how can I deal with this? I thought, right, I will choose a number of charities in different areas that I value, and then when I get spontaneous requests, I say I'm already fully committed to a number of charities, or if I'm feeling, it's Christmas or something like that, I might respond in a more generous way. But it was a way of partly protecting myself, whilst at the same time maintaining that kind of ethical outlook on life of wanting to share and help others. That's just my personal way of dealing with it, but it does help to eliminate some of that uncomfortable feeling you get when you know it's a good cause and saying no, go away, I don't want to give you anything, feels wrong somehow. But nevertheless, you can't help every single good cause that comes along. So we all need ways of dealing with it. That was just mine.
Coming back to the cognitive dissonance, and the idea of group identity and insecurity.
Yeah.
The guys who decided that they'd been told it was rubbish, they had to break with something that had formed part of their identity and part of their group. So you might think there is a psychological difference between those who found that the desire to remain part of a group and the inability to change their mind. They're psychologically in some way different from those who were prepared to change their mind. And how do you think this relates to the Sartre's existentialist kind of analysis of human psychology, with the business of being, the difficulty of being pour soi instead of just on soi, I think was the phrases.
Are those foreign words?
Well, the pour soi means human beings can be for themselves, as opposed to objects which are like stones, which are just in themselves and their identity can't change.
Okay.
And he said that the big problem with ethics was that you had to think through things for yourself. And that was difficult. It was much easier to take something as a given than to accept it. And it causes a great deal of anguish if you're trying to think things through the whole time.
Right.
I think that somehow, that existentialist description somehow relates to this cognitive dissonance, group identity.
Yes, I think certainly the idea that there is something quite fundamental in the psychology of the two halves of the group is a very plausible hypothesis. It has prima facie value, face value. It's a likely explanation. The other question that you raised about people thinking for themselves and that being part of the human condition, one of the things that we find when we run NLP courses is that one of the patterns that NLP developers have identified is what they call sameness difference. Some people have a default position to look for sameness, and others have a default position to look for difference. And a quick test of this, and you can do it with your friends for a little bit of fun, is take £3 coins and have 2 heads and 1 tail, and go around a group and ask people what they see. And some will say £3 coins, and others will say 2 heads and a tail. The ones who say £3 coins, when you check in other ways for sameness difference, usually fairly consistently opt opt for the sameness version, whereas the people who pick two heads and a tail tend to opt for spotting differences. This seems to be one of these kind of fundamental inclinations that people have. So I think Sartre was probably right for some people, not for others. Some people, same kind of pattern, some people tend to be self-referenced and others tend to be other-referenced. So let's say somebody collapses in the street. What should I do? The self-referenced person will decide for themselves what they think the right thing is. I can either help the person immediately, or if I'm not sure what's going on, I can take out my phone and phone an ambulance or something, but they will do something to respond to that situation. The other referenced person will tend to look around, because it's an unusual situation, and see what other people are doing. Now that can be a matter of life or death for the poor soul who's having a problem lying on the floor. Ideally what you want is the first person to come on the scene to be a self-reference person, because they will respond and do something. If the first person on the scene is a more other-reference person, they'll tend to look around and think, what are other people doing? And if the next person comes along is also other-referenced, they'll, what do you think we should do? And the poor person's dying on the floor. Now, this is, it's a subtle difference, but it's quite consistent when you run it with people. So I think Sartre's talking about the self-reference kind of person. He's not really talking about the other-referenced kind of person. Now, the other-referenced kind of person you would predict, and I'm not sure, would tend to be more deferential to authority figures. And the self-reference person would check what an authority figure is saying against their own understanding. So I tend to say to my students, even if a professor has written a thick hardback book which has received great reviews, it only stands or falls on the quality of its contents. So, you know a tree by its fruits is the self-reference kind of response. And I think many people are not self-referenced, they look to others for guidance. And Sartre doesn't cover that, I don't think.
But that's actually, I would slightly disagree there. Sartre says that the vast majority of human beings do reference against others. And the point of existentialism was to try and force people to be fully human by working things out for themselves, without the touchstone of a religion or an authority to tell them what was right or wrong.
So he's encouraging people to be more self-referenced?
I would say so.
In my
phrase it in your terminology, yes.
I think that's a worthwhile goal myself, but I may be misguided because some authority figures may in fact have all the answers for us. The problem is they're difficult to find.
Terry.
Not a very profound question, but you talked about the charity ball pens.
Oh yes.
Can you explain to me why I tend to feel guilty when I shred 3 free cards I've received in the post?
Well, that's the reciprocal. Well, it's a mixture, I suspect. I'm just talking off the top of my head here. It's a mixture of the reciprocal obligation and the kind of guilt that David feels that somehow doing that is inconsistent with your self-image as a good person. So part of you knows you've been conned, and so you destroy the cards.
You feel manipulated.
You feel manipulated, just like I do. So I collect them to show the people, you destroy them. It's the same kind of thing. Nevertheless, usually these are good causes. And so that kind of behaviour, that rejection of the manipulation, carries a price, which is a kind of guilt tag that makes us feel uncomfortable. I think it's something like that. That's just the top of my head.
Okay, do you want to just grab the mic and call it?
Are you telling me, when I was doing my national service...
When you were?
Doing my national service.
Yes.
Right, best cup of tea you could get, and the best Nelson square was at the Salvation Army. Much better than nothing. I was in there on one occasion, and I hadn't got enough to take the tea and the Nelson square. So they gave me...
Can you hold the microphone to your...
Now, it may be...
I'll summarise it for you.
I'm not saying I've been manipulated, because now, although it's a religious thing, the Salvation Army, I still feel I have an empathy towards the kind of people that run it, so I send them £10 a year.
Okay.
They're a religious setup.
Yeah.
An atheist.
I too, I am...
You just want to repeat, I don't think...
Oh yes, sorry.
All of that.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name again.
Paul.
When Paul was doing his national service, the best tea and cakes, was it?
Yeah. Nelson Squares.
Nelson Squares were available at the Salvation Army, so he used to go there. But one time he turned up and he didn't have enough money to buy them, so the Salvation Army people gave him a cup of tea in the Nelson Square free of charge. And that left him feeling that these people are good people, generous people, and so he continues to support them on a regular basis. Am I saying that he has been manipulated and there's something kind of negative about the generosity of the Salvation Army? Is it more or less that way?
I can't see that I've been manipulated because...
Paul, you have been.
There's no commitment. I don't feel indebted to them. I just think they're the sort of generous people like myself who on many occasions I've been in a restaurant and a tramp there and I bought him a soup.
Right, so
so I want to encourage that.
Okay, so he's saying, is my view that he was manipulated? And my view isn't that you were manipulated. My view is, and again I'm just talking off the top of my head now, but what strikes me is that these people exhibited a quality that you value, the quality of generosity.
Yes.
And that is an example that you would like to encourage. And so you've actualized it in your own life, and you have been generous to people who were generous to you and who you know are generous to others as well. I personally am a raving humanist, atheist. I don't believe in anything supernatural whatsoever, and I think people who are encouraging others to believe in supernatural things are misleading them. So, it's not something I approve of. Nevertheless, if I have stuff to go to a charity shop, my first choice is always the Salvation Army. Particularly because, as far as I'm aware, they do more to help a group that I feel particularly sympathetic towards, which is homeless people. And I don't think that value overrides my negative feelings about religious proselytization. And it sounds like you're not too different from me on that. So the religious side of it, even though generally I don't want to encourage it, or you don't either, nevertheless, in this case, it's overridden by a higher value, something like that. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, so you think I'm manipulated or not?
You're not manipulated, but you have been influenced by something that you're receptive to. But it's a good influence, not necessarily a negative one. You haven't been lured into harming others.
Talking of great orators who changed history, and what would you say about somebody like Trump, who's, I wouldn't call a great orator, but certainly very influential? Or do you think he is a great orator?
I wouldn't put him with even mediocre orators myself. But the Trump phenomenon is interesting, and I'm by no means an expert, but my sense from the bits and pieces I've picked up, mainly listening to debates on YouTube, and now I'm retired, I've got a bit more time for that, is that one of the things that he did was tap into a package of sentiments that other American politicians weren't tapping into. Groups that by and large felt bypassed by modern American society. And that, I think, swung it for him. There's probably a lot more to it than that, and he does seem to have some quite nasty traits as well. Nevertheless, he said things that others weren't saying that did resonate with a lot of the American people. And if we believe in democracy, and I know it's a very tight thing, but if we believe in democracy, then I think we have to say, okay, this has happened, and it's happened through democratic means, and so the debate has to continue, hopefully on robust grounds, and we'll find all these other techniques being used as well. Nevertheless, the commitment to democracy commits us to ongoing debate. Now, I was interested in, I got a little leaflet from the UK Humanists the other day, and I binned it, recycled it, sorry. Recycled it because I thought, well, all this information's on the internet, because I'd seen quite a bit of it on the internet. But there was a little section saying something about opposing the governments of, I think it was Slovakia, Hungary, Poland maybe. And I thought, all right, there's something funny about that. So I went on the internet and tried to find it and couldn't find it. But my thought, one of the reasons I thought it was funny was these are all democratically elected governments. So however much we might disagree with them, part of buying into the whole democratic polity is that sometimes people get elected that you don't agree with. And the democratic way is to debate with them rather than seek to foment some kind of revolution or something like that. And I was just surprised that humanists were saying this and kind of, I would say, almost mischaracterizing these governments, describing, I can't remember accurately, but it was a bit like, they were describing them as tyrannies or, undemocratic, when in fact they weren't. So I don't quite know where to go from there, but it does seem to me that there's a connection between humanist values and democratic values. And some of you may disagree, some of you may think that a strong leader is what we need. But it seems to me, and I'm quite happy to debate this, that humanism and democracy go hand in hand. And so even if we disagree with democratically elected governments, then we should use debate as our way forward of engaging with them. Yeah.
Okay, we're just about up to time. We've got time for two more quick ones, I'm afraid, just the people who've indicated already. Lisa and then Chris, if you can keep your questions brief, and Peter also, if I could ask you to be brief, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you, because I found that absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting, and I'm very, very glad you're not on my doorstep trying to sell me encyclopedias.
I used to work for Betterware, I did quite well actually. In the days we had a suitcase.
Hello. I see that you've got a new book out in February, Understanding Religious Experience.
Yeah.
I've been invited to Exeter University to debate the motion, should we tolerate religious fundamentalism? And I'm wondering whether you can give me some tips.
Well, I'm not sure that I can. What I would say is when I was a student, I read Karl Popper's The Open Society and its Enemies. And one of the things that he argues in that book is that open societies should be as tolerant as they can, but not of intolerant ideologies. That intolerant ideologies will undermine open societies. So, what does tolerance of fundamentalists mean? In democratic polity, where we allow people to believe what they want and freedom of expression and so on, there's no reason to seek to constrain fundamentalists. But when they become political, and here I'm thinking of political Islam, because there are many active Muslims who are working to change our democratic system and introduce Islamic law. And I would argue that that should be resisted by all people who are committed to democracy. Is that short enough?
Yeah, thanks very much.
It's the basis of another debate, I think.
Okay, we need to wrap things up now. Will you please give Peter another big round of applause? Our next social evening is Thursday the 1st of November at Moon in the Square. Our next dialogue meeting is on Wednesday the 7th of November in Sandford, and this is going to be a multi-faith discussion panel including a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew and a humanist.